Banks don't care if the house slowly destroys your future. They care if you can survive the monthly payment long enough to keep paying interest. That's the part almost nobody says out loud. Because when a bank approves you for a mortgage, most people hear something very different. They hear validation, stability, adulthood, progress. They hear a number that sounds like safety. But the approval number was never designed to protect your life. It was designed to protect the loan. And in 2026, that difference matters more than ever. Because millions of Americans are now discovering something deeply unsettling. You can earn more money than your parents ever did, and still feel one unexpected expense away from financial suffocation. Not because you failed, not because you wasted money, but because the entire definition of affordable housing quietly changed while nobody was paying attention. The real problem isn't just that homes became expensive. It's that modern affordability calculations stopped measuring human comfort a long time ago. Now they measure survivability. My name is Theo, and I spend way too much time thinking about why so many financially responsible people still feel permanently behind. If you're someone who earns decent money, makes rational financial decisions, and still feels like the future somehow keeps moving farther away, hit like and subscribe if this video helps you. Because today, we're going to walk through what home affordability actually looks like in 2026 by income level. Not the fantasy version, the real one. And the deeper we go, the more uncomfortable the math becomes. Because the number that matters isn't the house price. It's the life the payment quietly removes from you afterward. A man named Daniel earns $62,000 a year. 5 years ago, that income sounded respectable. Today, it sounds fragile. Daniel doesn't feel poor. That's what makes this so psychologically confusing. He works full-time, pays his bills, has decent credit, doesn't spend recklessly. He barely travels. Rarely buys expensive things. He even delayed upgrading his car because he wanted to be responsible. And after years of doing everything the financial system told him to do, he finally walks into a mortgage office expecting adulthood to begin. The bank approves him for a home around $290,000. At first, he feels relief. Until the monthly numbers arrive: mortgage, property tax, insurance, utilities, maintenance, PMI because he can't comfortably put 20% down. And suddenly the payment isn't just a payment anymore. It becomes a permanent reduction in oxygen. But here's what nobody tells you. The real problem isn't the mortgage itself. It's what the mortgage leaves behind. After taxes, Daniel brings home roughly $4,000 a month. The housing payment alone absorbs almost half of it. Not theoretically. Actually, and this is where the trap begins. Because modern affordability models assume the rest of life will behave predictably. They assume your car never fails at the wrong moment. They assume insurance premiums don't suddenly jump. They assume groceries remain mathematically manageable. They assume your body cooperates. They assume no layoffs, no burnout, no recession, no caregiving responsibilities, no invisible emergencies. But real life is almost entirely invisible emergencies. And the smaller the margin becomes, the more psychologically exhausting normal existence starts to feel. That's the hidden emotional cost of modern housing. Not poverty, compression. Daniel starts saying no to tiny things. Dinner invitations, weekend trips, new clothes he genuinely needs, preventive healthcare appointments. He tells himself it's temporary. Most people do. But temporary has a strange habit of becoming identity. And slowly, the house that was supposed to represent security begins quietly producing fear. Not dramatic fear. Functional fear. The kind that sits silently in your chest every time an email notification appears. The kind that makes you calculate grocery totals while standing in the aisle. The kind that turns every unexpected expense into a small psychological emergency. And the disturbing part is this. From the bank's perspective, Daniel is succeeding. He's making payments. The system is working perfectly. Just not for him. Now compare that to Melissa. Melissa and her husband earn about $118,000 combined. This is the income range most Americans still associate with stability. Middle-class professional, comfortable. The kind of household that's supposed to be able to buy a home. And technically, they can. That's what makes the next part so deceptive. Because the middle-income trap in 2026 doesn't look like financial failure. It looks like permanent optimization. Melissa and her husband buy a home for around $520,000. Not a luxury house. Just a normal suburban home in a decent school district. The mortgage payment is high, but manageable. At least on paper. And paper is where modern affordability still looks convincing, but the real problem isn't the payment. The real problem is the ecosystem attached to the payment: childcare, commuting, home repairs, rising insurance costs, higher utility bills, HOA fees, medical deductibles, subscription creep, school activities. Everything costs more once the house exists. And this is where the invisible financial system becomes fascinating, because homeownership doesn't just consume money. It reshapes behavior. Melissa starts turning every decision into efficiency math. Can they afford another child? Can they risk one parent working less? Can they visit family this year? Can they survive if one income disappears for 6 months? But here's the deeper layer nobody talks about. The psychological burden isn't created by being broke. It's created by having too much to lose. That's the modern middle-class condition. You earn enough to build a life large enough to become terrified of interruption. And interruption is inevitable. The dishwasher breaks. The roof ages. Property taxes rise. One child needs braces. One parent develops health problems. One employer restructures. One recession arrives at the wrong time. Suddenly, the household isn't building freedom anymore. It's defending infrastructure. And the number that matters is no longer income. It's margin. Margin is what determines whether life feels flexible or fragile. Most people think high income creates safety. But safety doesn't come from income. It comes from distance between obligations and collapse. That distance has been shrinking for years, quietly, systemically, and this is why so many households earning 6 figures still feel anxious all the time. Their lifestyle expanded faster than their resilience, not because they were irresponsible, because the modern economy rewards maximum allocation. Banks lend based on thresholds. Real estate markets normalize escalation. Social expectations expand around income. The higher you earn, the more the system encourages you to convert future labor into present obligations. That's the real business model, not helping you build wealth, helping you monetize your future earnings immediately. And this is where affordability becomes emotionally deceptive. Because Melissa and her husband technically own a home, but ownership starts feeling strange when most of your future income already belongs to decisions you made years ago. Then there's Jonathan. Jonathan earns around $240,000 a year. From the outside, he appears financially untouchable. Beautiful house, luxury SUV, vacation photos, retirement contributions, high-status career. People assume he escaped the affordability problem entirely. But high income creates a different trap: lifestyle anchoring. Jonathan buys a home around $1.2 million. Again, not because he's irrational. Because in many high-cost American cities, that's increasingly what upper-middle-class normality looks like. And at first, everything feels sustainable. Until the invisible costs begin stacking. Higher property taxes, massive interest payments, maintenance costs that behave like luxury taxes, private school pressure, professional appearance expectations, networking expenses disguised as social life, and then the biggest invisible cost of all, career dependence. Because the larger the financial structure becomes, the harder it becomes to psychologically leave the machine supporting it. That's the part people misunderstand about high earners. The prison gets quieter, not smaller. Jonathan doesn't fear homelessness. He fears downward mobility, and modern professional life is built around that fear. The bigger the mortgage, the less freedom your income actually has. The higher the salary, the more catastrophic career instability becomes. And this is where the entire idea of affordability quietly collapses. Because affordability is usually discussed as a mathematical question. Can you make the payment? But that was never the real question. The real question is, what kind of life does the payment force you to continue living? That's the number almost nobody calculates. A mortgage isn't just a housing expense. It's a behavioral contract with your future self. And in 2026, many Americans are unknowingly signing contracts that eliminate flexibility long before they eliminate debt. But here's the truly unsettling part. The system doesn't need you to thrive, it only needs you to remain functional. That's why so many people feel financially exhausted despite appearing successful. Because modern financial life is increasingly optimized around extraction, not relief. Every layer has a payment attached: housing, transportation, healthcare, education, insurance, convenience. Even time itself now has subscription pricing attached to it. And homeownership amplifies all of it. Not because owning a home is inherently bad, But because people confuse asset ownership with financial freedom, the two are not automatically connected anymore, especially when the asset requires decades of uninterrupted labor to sustain. But here's what nobody tells you about affordability calculators. They almost never measure emotional sustainability. They measure default probability. That's a completely different thing. You can survive a mortgage while slowly destroying your ability to rest. You can technically afford a home while becoming permanently anxious. You can build equity while sacrificing flexibility, health, relationships, and peace. And millions of people are doing exactly that right now. Quietly, respectably. The strange thing about modern housing stress is that it rarely looks dramatic. It looks normal. That's why it's so hard to identify. People still go to work, still post smiling photos, still renovate kitchens, still refinance, still upgrade furniture, still participate in the performance of stability. Meanwhile, underneath everything, there's this constant low-frequency pressure. A feeling that one disruption could destabilize the entire structure. And this is where the emotional cost becomes existential. Because eventually, people stop asking, "Can I buy this house?" and start asking, "What happens if I can never slow down again?" That's the hidden trade hiding inside many modern mortgages. Not just debt, dependency. The dependency on continued productivity, continued income, continued employability, continued health, continued participation in an increasingly expensive system. And the higher the cost of living climbs, the more dangerous interruption becomes. This is why home affordability in 2026 feels psychologically heavier than previous generations remember. Not simply because homes cost more, but because the consequences of falling behind became harsher. Healthcare costs punish instability. Retirement systems reward uninterrupted investing. Job markets punish gaps. Insurance punishes risk. Housing markets punish hesitation. Everything now compounds against fragility. And this creates a society full of people who look financially functional while internally feeling trapped. But the deepest layer of this entire conversation isn't about real estate. It's about identity. Because for decades, Americans were taught that buying a home meant you had made it. That ownership itself represented safety, maturity, progress, stability. But what happens when the symbol of stability begins creating instability instead? That contradiction is psychologically devastating, especially for people who followed every rule, went to school, worked hard, built credit, saved responsibly, avoided reckless decisions, and still arrived at a version of adulthood that feels financially claustrophobic. That's why this conversation creates so much emotional tension. Because people don't just feel priced out of houses. They feel priced out of the future they were promised. And the real tragedy is that many won't realize it until after they buy. Because affordability isn't tested when everything goes right. It's tested when life behaves like life. When the layoff happens. When the parent gets sick. When inflation stays high longer than expected. When burnout arrives. When children need more than the spreadsheet predicted. When the career no longer feels sustainable. That's when the hidden architecture of the payment finally reveals itself. And by then, exiting becomes emotionally and financially expensive. None of this means homeownership is automatically wrong. That's not the point. The point is that the modern definition of affordability has drifted dangerously far away from human well-being. The system calls something affordable if the payment's statistically clear, but human beings are not statistical models. They're emotional organisms absorbing pressure over decades. And eventually, pressure changes behavior. It changes health, relationships, risk tolerance, career decisions, dreams, freedom. That's the real cost. Not just money leaving your account every month, but optionality leaving your life. And maybe that's the hardest truth underneath all of this. The financial milestones many people were taught to chase were designed for a different economic reality. A world where housing costs, healthcare costs, education costs, and retirement systems behave differently. But the cultural expectations survived long after the math changed. And now millions of people are trying to force themselves into financial structures that no longer produce the emotional outcomes they once promised. Which means the real question in 2026 is no longer, how much house can you afford? It's, how much future are you willing to permanently allocate just to maintain the appearance of stability? Because the system will always offer you more debt than peace, more obligation than freedom, more payment than margin. And if you don't consciously measure the emotional cost yourself, Nobody else inside the system will do it for you. Thank you so much for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe to see the latest videos. I wish you success.